Hey guys, it's Justine here from I Should Read That, and today I'm going to be doing my September wrap-up. So despite the fact that September was a really crazy month, I managed to read 11 books this month, and I'm very pleased with myself, and the MVP of the month really goes to audiobooks, because if it weren't for audiobooks, I would not have gotten to these 11. So I am just gonna go ahead and dive straight in. This is a really good mix of actually, it's not a really good mix at all. It is almost exclusively fantasy. So the first book that I read this month was one that I was very excited for. It's the sequel to a book that I read a couple months ago, I think maybe in May. I'll try to find that wrap up and put it down below if you want to see my thoughts on the first book. But this is Bloody Rose, and this is by Nicholas Eames. Bloody Rose is the sequel to Kings of the Wyld, which was his kind of smash hit debut. We've been waiting for this book for a little while, I think. It's not been a huge wait, but there's just something about Kings of the Wyld that is so insanely fun and ridiculous and just like the best sort of time you could possibly have with your friends if you are stuck in a fantasy setting and you are in mortal peril. I absolutely loved it, and I also really liked Bloody Rose, although it is a very different book. So Bloody Rose is about a mercenary band. Of course, it follows Rose, who is nicknamed Bloody Rose. She is the leader. In the first book, we follow Saga, which is her father Gabriel's band, and this follows Fable, which is her own. And it takes place in, I think it's 5 years after the events of the first book. So Rose has grown up a little bit. Those things have happened. This is a completely separate story, although we do get some cameos from the first book, which are really fun. Instead of following Rose, this book follows Tam, who is a girl who is sort of slinging drinks in one of the taverns to these mercenaries, and she desperately wants to be a bard. Her mother was a famous bard, her father was a mercenary, but her mother was killed many years ago, and it sort of destroyed her family, so her father forbids it. However, she ends up getting the chance to audition for Fable, and she ends up joining them on their crazy adventures. And that's really all I'm going to say, because a lot of the joy of this book is sort of discovering what's really going on here. Something that I liked about this that I feel developed well upon Bloody Rose is the fact that we talk more about sort of the implications of the lifestyle in this book. So not only do we talk about sort of the mercenaries and how they live their lives, it's very intentionally kind of parallel to rock stars and the rock star lifestyle. And we also talk about what happens when sort of all of the monsters and these fantasy creatures that they kill in these arenas sort of die out. They're being bred, they're in these horrible conditions. What's going to happen to them? What's going to happen to this lifestyle in this world after they all die out? There's a lot more deep stuff, I think, that's going on in this book rather than in Kings of the Wyld. Another thing is that this book, while it does have a lot of very funny moments, the first couple of pages are like making me cackle, it is not the same sort of constant humor as the first book. One of the things that made the first book stand out a lot is the fact that it's funny. Like, it's really funny, and some people don't quite have that sense of humor, which I understand. But it is absolutely hilarious, and like, it was making me cackle with delight, and you don't get that as much in this one. This is a little bit more of a serious book. I ended up giving this 4 out of 5 stars. I really enjoyed it. I didn't like it as much as Kings of the Wyld, but again, they are very different books, and I think that Kings of the Wyld is more suited to my kind of taste. The next book that I read is also a sequel to a book that came out last year, which I read and reviewed last year, although I don't have a video review for it. But it was a book that I really enjoyed, and I think I liked this one even better, which is a little bit of a surprise. I find that that doesn't always happen to me. So this is Wildcard by Marie Lu. I'm not going to talk about this too much because I did actually do a full review, which I will link below if you're interested in my thoughts. It is spoiler-free for Wildcard, but it does have mega spoilers for the end of Warcross, because this book just is a mega spoiler for the first one, which makes a lot of sense. It's hard to say anything without sort of referencing what happens in Warcross, but basically this picks up right away where the first book ends, and we dive a little bit deeper into the world, and not necessarily into the Warcross games. If you don't know, this world is big into virtual reality, and there's essentially like a virtual reality sort of Olympic type event, and we don't go into that as much, which I really appreciated. We get some amazing growth in our characters, and Amika and Hideo, who are 2 of my favorite young adult science fiction characters. and I just really, really love this. I think I might have liked it even more than the first, as I said. It's just a fun duology, so if you haven't picked these up, don't be deterred by what I think, quite frankly, are not nice covers. I think these covers are pretty terrible. But just read them for a really fun sci-fi romp. I gave this 4.25 out of 5 stars, which I realize is super specific, but it was a sort of perfect sort of balance between 4 and 4.5 stars for me. I really enjoyed this one. Next up, we have a book that was long awaited for many, many people. Rather than a sequel, this is actually technically a prequel, and it's the start to its own sort of quartet of books, I believe, because this author tends to write in quartets. This is Tempest and Slaughter. This is by Tamora Pierce. I have tried to do videos about this book. I did a couple of reading vlogs if you're interested, but like I every single time have had to cut out tons of me rambling about how much I love Tamora Pierce because she is so iconic for me, and she is for a lot of readers who are sort of my age and maybe a little bit older, maybe a little bit younger. She wrote her first quartet, which is the Song of the Lioness Quartet, in the 80s. So she's been around for a while, and she's just been inspiring young women for so long, and I love her so much, and I'm not going to get onto this tangent, but Tempest and Slaughter is the prequel to the Immortals Quartet, which I have not actually read, and I'm going to read as a result of this, mostly because I just didn't know it existed until fairly recently. And this follows a character named Aram Draper, who is going to become the sort of famed, powerful mage who we see in the Immortals. So this is about his childhood. What's really interesting about this one, what I really, really liked about this one, and it took a while for me to adjust to, is the fact that it is not a straight up narrative. You don't have kind of a plot throughout the book. It's really just, I think it covers like 3 or 4 years, maybe 4 years of his schooling from when he's about 11 to when he's about 14, and it just sort of is snapshots of his life during this time. It's very strange to get used to because you don't have, Aram must do this thing. This is the evil that is lurking within the kingdom that he must fight. That's not what this book is. It's just sort of looking at the things that he's doing, how his schooling is going, the friends that he makes who will sort of shape his future life. They are people that we see in the Immortals, and it's just nice. And I have to say that, I'm going to go on a tangent again, but something about Tamora Pierce's writing and her worlds are just so wonderful and full of hope. Literally, I'm not joking, I was looking up from reading this book on the bus, and everything looked a little bit brighter and a little bit more okay. And I feel like in sort of the times that we have right now, Tamora Pierce's books are just like the perfect antidote to real life. So if you haven't tried her yet, I would so highly recommend her. You can start with this, but you can also start with the first of the quartets, which is the Song of the Lioness. Starts with Alana the First Adventure. Just read Tamora Pierce. I gave this book 4.5 out of 5 stars. I loved it. I loved it so much. It's just the perfect escape. Another sequel. Hi, I'm reading a lot of sequels this month. Yeah, okay, so I have a ton of sequels this month. Some of them have been great, as we've seen. This particular one was probably the most disappointing book of the month, unfortunately, and I really love the author's world building, but I think she can kind of struggle with characters. I love her plotting, but again, there's just something that really falls short. This was really the case in this. This is The Caged Queen. This is by Kristin Ciccarelli. So Kristin Ciccarelli's name might sound a little bit familiar if you have read The Last Namsara, if you've heard anything about The Last Namsara. It was a huge kind of smash hit YA fantasy debut last year, and this is a book that kind of falls in a funny place between a sequel and a companion novel. And I love companion novels, so I was very interested in that. I was very interested in the fact that we were following a different character, because although I like Asha, who's the main character in the first book, I didn't really like the romance. I wasn't sold on the romance, and I did not enjoy it, so I was glad to get another character, another perspective, and I won't say too much about this because it will be very spoilery, like Wildcard is. we follow a character named Roa, and she's very, very minor in the first book, but she does a lot of important things that sort of push the plot forward. And we follow her and her love interest, and it's another super political book. I love that. I think that her sort of politicking is great in her books, and I think her world building is magnificent. I love her world building, but Roa is possibly one of the dimmest YA heroines I have ever read, and I feel like it's very unkind, which isn't why I'm not saying she's stupid or she's dumb, because that's not the case. She's just super oblivious. We're constantly told that she's this amazing, like, strategist, and, you know, she's taught Dax, who's a character in the first book, he's Ash's brother, strategy and all of this, and she's super smart and capable, and she's not at all. And, you know, she was just really frustrating to read about. She keeps, like, stumbling her way through the plot. There's some books where you are told that a character is great and amazing and good at all these things, and when you read them, you are like, that is not true. She is not the person that we are told she is. She's not smart, she is not, you know, this great strategist, she's not any of these things, and I quite frankly don't believe that she did all the amazing things she did in the first book, which is really troubling. The other big problem I had with it is this is just one of those books where 85% of the plot could have been resolved if she just had a conversation with some of the people around her, because they don't talk to each other, because they don't talk to each other, that adds to the tension of the book. I'm sorry, but if that is something that you have in your book, that is not, you know, your book isn't well written, your plot isn't well written. If you can have a conversation with another character and be like, hey, this thing that you're doing is not very nice, and that person's like, what? And then, you know, everything is resolved. That's not a good plot to me. I really hate books that do this, and this is very, very guilty of it. There are a couple of instances where I understand and I get it, but for the most part, no. I gave this 2.5 out of 5 stars, which I think honestly is quite generous. I know I'm very much in the minority on this one. Everyone is reading it and loving it, but if you hate that kind of plot, and if you sort of hate the kind of characters that are, you know, said to be one thing but really don't live up to that, I think that this might not necessarily be the book for you. Right, so the next book that I have is another sequel to a book that I read last month that I wasn't hugely impressed with, but as the book went on, about 60% in, I was like, yes, this is amazing. So once the groundwork was laid, then everything became much, much better, and I thought that the sequel would end up being much better than the first, and that was very much the case. This is Tarnished City by Vic James. This is the second book in the Dark Gifts trilogy, the first one being Gilded Cage, which I will show you, I'll link whatever I talked about last month, but I wasn't sold on it in the first sort of, you know, 60% of the first book. I really struggled with a lot of the characters, particularly our sort of heroine Abby, who I still really don't like, but she does become much better, and I just wasn't really interested in sort of the common people that we are supposed to be interested in. This takes place in a world that is very much like our own, however the aristocracy has this magic that they call the skill, and in order to sort of keep the peace between this very small population of aristocrats, not aristocats, and the common people have to serve them as slaves in their slave days for 10 years. So we follow a family that is doing their slave days together, and we also get the perspectives of the aristocrats, not aristocats. And I really couldn't care less about the common family, which is a terrible thing to say, but I really love the aristocratic point of views. I really was interested in the magic. There's lots of politics here, so I saw a lot of promise, and that was very much delivered on in this book. I find that a lot of YA authors are very like, ooh, I'm so bad and terrible, I'm gonna break your heart, so you better watch out. In my book, everyone's gonna die. And then, like, someone with 10 lines who we see for, like, you know, a few pages dies, and you're like, that's not heartbreaking. I am not sad. Vic James is not one of those authors. She is not shy about killing people off. She has no problem bumping someone off in possibly a really horrible way in order to further the plot, and I love that so much. I love that she's a ruthless author. So if you are interested in sort of a much darker YA that does, you know, kill off these characters, I would highly recommend Gilded Cage. If you don't like it, I would say stick with it, because things things really ramp up in the second one. I ended up giving this, I believe, 4 out of 5 stars. I really did enjoy this a lot. So next up, let's talk about a couple of the audiobooks that I read, because I read 3 audiobooks this month, which is pretty impressive. I don't get through that many audiobooks. I much prefer to read physical books, so the fact that I have been so busy this month I really read a lot of stuff on audio, and I'm very, very glad that I did. So the first book to talk about is God's Grave by Jay Kristoff. So I am completely addicted to these books. I love Nevernight so much. I loved God's Grave so much. And it's just like the best, probably the best audiobooks I've ever listened to, which I haven't listened to very many, but they are spectacular, and I can even tell that they are spectacular, not having a lot of experience with audiobooks. So if you're interested, pick them up, seriously. God's Grave is another book that is really difficult to talk about without spoiling the first one, but basically this world is sort of Venice meets ancient Rome, and that ancient Rome comes much more into play in this book, and it's about a girl named Mia Corvere, and she is learning to become an assassin in order to avenge her family. Her father was accused of treason and executed in the beginning of the first book, and her family sort of falls apart, and she essentially becomes an orphan living on the streets by herself. So she becomes a member of this school for assassins, and that's sort of the first book. It's very much just kind of like Hogwarts, but with sex and death and, you know, blood and murder, and it's great, and I loved it. So this one sort of continues on from the events of the first book, and we get to see Mia doing what Mia does best, which is murder a lot of people, be very, very sneaky, and she gets to develop her sort of dark-kin powers a little bit more. She can slip in and out of shadows, and she can manipulate shadows. And I was convinced that I wouldn't enjoy this as much as I liked Nevernight, but I enjoyed it just as much. It has a spectacular ending. It's like falling down a flight of stairs. It's just revelation after revelation after revelation, and being like, oh my god, what is happening? And I loved it so much. So I can now understand why people are so upset that Dark Dawn, which is the third book in this trilogy, has been delayed slightly. It's coming out in September of 2019. So I highly recommend you get caught up on the series now, because when that last book comes out, you are going to need it like I need it right now. I believe I gave it like 4.75 out of 5 stars. I really loved it. It's just so good. And again, the audiobooks are fantastic. I would so, so highly recommend them. The next audiobook that I read was Career of Evil by Robert Galbraith, which is the third Cormoran Strike book. Of course, Robert Galbraith is J.K. Rowling. The thing that everyone loves to bring up about this book, and I will probably bring up about this book, is that Robin, who's of course Cormoran's assistant and sort of like quasi-partner, but not really, gets sent a leg in the post. Like, all of my friends and family who have read this are like, Robin gets sent a leg in the post. Who sends a leg in the post? Which is like, it's the thing that everyone fixates on, and it's so silly and funny until you realize that the person who sent her a leg in the post is also a serial killer and is stalking her. So we have a much more, I think, sort of high-risk plot here, because it's not like in the first one they're investigating a murder that's already happened, and it was a one-off. In the second one, we're investigating a murder that's already happened. That's a one-off. In the third book, it's a serial killer, which just like ramps things up so much. The thing that I love about these books, which I worry about for sort of the next one, which I'm currently listening to, and sort of any subsequent book, is that I love the relationship between Cormoran and Robin, because they're not romantically involved. They are friends, they are business partners, they work together, but they have such this incredible mutual respect for each other that I really, really like. I really like seeing the dynamic between the two, and I really like Robin. This is Robin's book, so if you have been reading these books and you really like Robin, you have to get to this one, because it talks about her so much, and she becomes really a fully fleshed out character in this book, and I think that she's just spectacular. She's one of my favorite female characters now. I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. I really enjoyed this one. I am currently listening to the fourth one, as I said. You're gonna want to pick up the fourth one immediately. They're really, really fun. I just really enjoy them. They're such a fun read. The last book that I don't have in my hands is Daughter of the Pirate King by Tricia Levenseller. I was borrowing this from my friend Asha, and I Really, really enjoyed the heck out of it. It is a fun book, it is a fluffy book, it is not a particularly serious book, but it has serious themes to it. It's like the perfect summer read. The Daughter of the Pirate King follows a girl named Alosa, and she is, I'm sure you can guess, the daughter of the Pirate King. So her father has sent her out on this mission to retrieve a map from a particular ship. So she sort of does the Lila Bard thing, and it's the only thing that I like that Lila Bard ever did. She gets herself captured onto this ship in order to sort of investigate it and hunt down this map. Of course, we have a particularly handsome first mate on the ship. His name is Raiden, and he is the brother of the captain, and they kind of dual wits and sort of are very, obviously very attracted to each other, and they kind of have to, you know, she has to stay on her mission, and he has to kind of try to block her. He knows that something's up, and it's just so much fun. I think this is definitely, first and foremost, a YA romance. It's a little bit kind of, I think, slightly steamier than a few YA romances out there. But it is first and foremost a romance, and it is an adventure, and it's so fun, and it's super quotable. And, you know, again, you have this badass girl who's actually going around and pirating, which is very exciting. And I want more books like this. It deals with some very serious themes. So there is, you know, parental abuse, there is some, you know, attempted sexual assault in it, but I don't know, there's something about the way that she wrote this book and the way that these characters interact and how just strong and ridiculous of a character Alosa is, that it's such a fun read. I really, really enjoyed this so much. So I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. I would highly recommend it. I'm very interested to see what Daughter of the Siren Queen, which is the second book in this, I believe it's a trilogy, I'm really interested to see where that's going to go, because I am not sure that a lot of the elements that made this a really fun book for me will necessarily be in the second book, but I'm very open to reading it. I'm very interested to see what happens next. Back to audiobooks, I did read a third audiobook this month, and I'm doing this thing with Audible, which is working really, really well for me. I will pick a book on my TBR, my extensive TBR that I know I'm just not going to get to anytime soon, but I really want to read, and I listened to the audiobook of that. This has worked really great for Simon versus the Homo Sapien Agenda, it has worked really great for Children of Time, and also for Nevernight. So these were 3 books that I was never going to get around to, listen to the audiobooks, and it worked out great. So I decided to do the same thing with this next book, and I'm very glad that I did. This is After Atlas by Emma Newman. Emma Newman wrote Planetfall, which is one of my favorite books of the year. I absolutely adore it, and you guys are probably maybe a little bit sick of hearing me talk about it because it's just so good, and I love it, and it's wonderful. I went into this knowing that it was going to be a different experience because, first of all, I read Planetfall. I did not listen to the audiobook, and it's a very different book. That's a much more kind of classic humans go to a planet, colonize, and things go terribly wrong book. This is much more of a kind of sci-fi noir type of book. Our main character, Carlos, is a police officer, and his mother was one of the crew members of Atlas that left, I think it was 40 years ago. So he is called in to investigate the murder of a particular cult called the Circle. They're kind of anti-technology cult that he used to be a member of, and his father is still a member of. So he has to go in and investigate this murder, and obviously things are not quite what they seem. There's more going on here than meets the eye. I really liked the way that Emma Newman sort of investigates how policing would work and how policing would kind of happen, and how all of these normal things that we understand happen with police work would function in a sort of much more advanced scientific society than we have now. So it is a near future type thing, but not too near. It takes place in London and just outside of London. It's a funny one. It really feels so different from the first book. All these books are kind of interconnected with each other, but they're not direct sequels. So you could technically start with this book if you wanted to. But the first book does tie in a little bit more than I had anticipated, and I loved the way that it did tie in. So if you were interested in this, I would highly recommend reading Planetfall first, just for a little bit of background. I believe I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. I really like this, and it has a spectacular ending. I try to not let the endings influence my opinion on books too much, but sometimes that just kind of happens. I think that in terms of the ending, I would have given it a higher rating, but I I think overall, 4 out of 5 stars, it's a really solid read. The next book that I had to talk about is my Fairy Loot book for August. So a lot of you may have received this. It's been a really interesting one, and it's had a lot of mixed reviews, and I totally understand why, but I ended up really enjoying it. This is These Rebel Ways by Sarah Rash. So this book looks quite piratey, perhaps. You might have noticed that. It was in the pirate-themed Fairy Loot box. It has been very much marketed as a pirate book, but it is not. So what this book is actually about, because it's not about pirates, in my opinion and the opinion of many reviewers, it is about 3 characters who are living on this particular island that is kind of contested territory. Another nation has tried to take over this island, and there has been a revolution before this book happens, and the islanders win. The place is called Grace Lorraine, and the Grace Lorraines and the people of the other country, which I believe is called Agrid, are now negotiating a peace treaty. So that's kind of where this book starts. So we have a girl named Adeluna, or Lou, this will be important in a minute, who was kind of almost like a soldier, a child soldier during the war, and she is now the daughter of 2 politicians, and she's going to be a politician herself. She loves Grace Lorraine so much, and she's very passionate about this island. And next we have a character named Dex, or Devereaux, and he is the sort of, I guess he'd be the more piratey type character. He's kind of an outlaw, he is a raider, and he is thrown in jail at the very beginning of the book, and it turns out that he will have a lot of impact on the plot. And we have a character named, I believe it's Benet, I call him Bennett, and his nickname is Ben, and he is actually the Prince of Agrid, and he is sort of slowly being crushed under the incredible religious oppression of his country. He is expected to carry on with this very, it's almost like a Spanish Inquisition inspired type of government, and he is having his doubts. So one of the things that made this really complicated, every character has a nickname. We have Lou, we have Dex, which I'm not entirely sure where Dex comes from, Devereaux, but that's okay. And we have Ben, but sometimes they're referred to as their nicknames, sometimes they're referred to as their full names, and it's kind of tough in the beginning to sort out who we're talking about. I found it very, very confusing initially. It took a little while for me to iron that out. We also have the first, I'd say 120 pages or so are really difficult because there's a lot of info dumping, there's a lot of stuff we need to know in order for the plot to move forward, and I don't think it's well executed, and I think that that is one of the things that is driving people away from this book. When you get past all of that, this book is great! This book is fantastic! I loved it so much! If we had sort of the beginning of it rewritten and we got rid of all of the freaking nicknames, I think that this would have been one of my favorite books of the year. It was just everything that I want and I love in YA. We had fantastic characters, we had a fantastic romance, we had a fantastic love interest. All of these things were so good, but I feel like the barrier of entry is so high because you have to get through like 100 or 120 pages in order to get to the good stuff. I think I'm going to do a full review of this. I think there's a lot to unpack here, and I would encourage people to maybe give this a try, just knowing that it is a difficult one to get into. I love the politics, I love the world, I love the magic, I love the characters, but tough to get into. I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. I enjoyed the heck out of this book. It's super fun. So the last book that I read, because I completely confused myself and actually filmed one of my October reads instead of this last one because I've left this so late that sometimes you mix up your books. I have Snapshot by Brandon Sanderson. This is a novella. It is a complete standalone. It is not linked to any of his other books, and this is actually more of a sci-fi read than a fantasy one, which is very exciting. I love a Brandon Sanderson novella. I just think that anything he writes is going to be spectacular. I really ended up enjoying this. But I think that I prefer his other novellas maybe a little bit more, so this was a really interesting read for me. Snapshot takes place in a kind of near future society, very, very similar to our own. However, the police force have these things called snapshots that they can use as an investigative tool. We have sort of a entire day in a particular city, reconstructed down to the molecular level. All the people, all the things, all the food, everything that happens on this particular day is reconstructed in what is called a snapshot. So police officers can go in, sort of having the future knowledge that something is going to happen, and they can go and sort of investigate. They can see where a suspect has been previously. They can see who turns up at a place that is going to become a crime scene. So we have our two characters who are sort of snapshot detectives, and we get the impression that they are very low on the food chain in terms of the police, and they have a crime that they have to investigate, and word gets out that something else has happened on this day. So they decide they're going to investigate that as well. Something they haven't been told about, they have no knowledge of. Turns out that there was a huge sort of mass murder that happens on that day, so they have to figure out what happened without sort of letting the people on the outside world know. I really like this. It was a little bit of a slow start, which is unfortunate in a novella because it's short. You don't want a slow start. It's like 145 pages, maybe 125 pages long, and it took me a while to get into it, but I ended up really enjoying it. Don't read the author's note because that's going to give away the entire thing, but he talks about in the author's note that he loves detective stories. He's always wanted to write one, so this is kind of his take on the detective story, which it ends up being a very Sanderson kind of book. I really liked it. I thought it was interesting. I liked one of the detectives. I didn't like the other. It's an interesting little story. It's an interesting little book. I would recommend it if you're looking for something short, if you're looking for something a little bit different, and if you like Sanderson, you should of course check it out because, as I said, everything that he writes is spectacular. I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. So those are the 11 books that I read in the month of September. It was a spectacular reading month for me, although I did have one disappointment. Everything else that I read was a 4 or 5 star book, so can't really complain about that, can you? I would love to know in the comments if you've read any of these books, if you have read any spectacular books in the month of September, if you're reading anything great right now, because I know this is going out a little bit later than usual. I would love to hear from you. I post bookish content to this channel fairly frequently, so hit subscribe, check back soon, and I will see you next time.